Hi everyone, welcome to part 2 of my Go tiny experiments, couple of videos. So in part 1 I was looking mainly at idioms in Go. In this one what we're going to do is look at using Go to interface with Google Gemini. And as a consequence, the actual experiment function bodies are fairly simple. And in fact, I've actually got some additional tiny habit related stuff in here as well, just for a bit of fun. But the actual response, the request response bit is pretty simple. It's just adjusted for each experiment slightly to try out different contexts and different ideas. But up at the top we have the sort of, the heavy lifting, if you like. So we've got our called Gemini API, which is this big sort of function here, which does all of the heavy lifting and the error checking, all that sort of stuff, which makes the individual experiments in terms of the bit that's actually handling the call fairly straightforward. We've got the usual error checks, and I spoke a little bit about how Go, and then you said Google, how Go handles error checking and the way it does it versus the way you may have come across it with exception handling in other languages. We've got, I think I mentioned in the other video, I'm using this sort of standardized menu feature going forward for these tiny experiments. So expect this to come up quite a bit in terms of you'll start to recognize this sort of standard layout depending on which language we're working in. Of course, it will change as to whether or not the language has, is very strong on the case side of things, or whether there's other ways in which functions can be dispatched through, say, something like pattern matching. So it would be interesting it's an interesting thing to look at, how you might want to handle simple menus. And there may be better ways of doing this. Like I said, this is just something I'm sort of putting out there in which people can just mess around with, break, refactor. So again, this idea of being experimental in these videos, rather than explaining the code. So we're trying to roll our sleeves up. Again, you will obviously need Go installed if you want to follow through with this. I've also installed Go, a Go add-in for this, just to make life a little bit easier in terms of error checking, that sort of stuff. And to make navigation a bit easier, I've got the outline section here. There's also some, because we're dealing with API keys, that's the other thing you will need to run this properly. You will need a Gemini API key. Now, the way I'm doing it on my system is I'm actually pulling it in from an environment key, which is the way I sort of prefer to do it when I'm doing these sort of videos, because that way I'm not sort of revealing my API key. The code does have a feature in it where you can actually hard code in it, even though it sort of advises against it. And the way the checking works is it checks firstly to see, is there an OS key present? If there isn't, then it will attempt to use whatever's in here. And if this still says this, then it will just remind you that you need to get an API key. So it doesn't matter. The point is, it doesn't matter whether you use whether you set an environmental value as your API key, or you hard code it in here. It will do either or. It handles either method. And you get the API key from Google. You need a Google account. And what I'll do is I'll include a link to that in the descriptions, along with this code, which I'll stick on GitHub, and anything else to do with installation of installation of Go, and other associated stuff, yada, 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 that sort of stuff. So, yeah. So yeah, Go version, I would sort of like to just check that everything's working fine and dandy in the terminal. That's the command to basically build this in Go. And then we're just going to run it here, because then we can sort of look at the code, everything side by side fairly easily. So let's do that. There's our friend, the interactive Gemini AP experiment dispatcher. Okay, so we're just going to do some very simple stuff here. Like I said, it's leaning pretty heavily into this request function that we've got, and anything else is really just supporting that. So let's go down to the experiments just so you can see the bit here. So here what we're doing is we're sending a prompt. All these prompts are hard coded. I'm sure you can do something clever with this, where you could strip it, gut everything out, and actually do some clever dispatch things where it actually prompts for different things. But here I've hard coded the prompt, so you could put some input prompts in here to actually ask it to prompt for a fun fact, request for a fun fact. But here we're hard coding. So okay, so the prompt Gemini for a fun fact about Go programming. Hopefully I haven't set my my timeouts too severe on here. There is a timeout value in here which you can change if you need to there as well. And just that way it doesn't sit there while you're trying to work out what's going on. Yeah, so this is basically just what comes back from Google Gemini. So, and all these are just really experimenting with different things. So we got creative writing prompts. Again, everything leaning into this called Gemini API function. Writing a short whimsical story about a cloud. Where are we? There you go. Write a short whimsical story about a cloud who's lost its shape and went on an adventure to find it. And you'll see underneath each one, and these I've put in myself, there's a little tiny experiment you can do. In there, tiny habit, creative spark, every evening generate a short story prompt and jot down 3 ideas inspired by it. And the tiny habit here was daily 5-minute Go fact check before starting code, generate and read one fun fact about Go. Now these are all hard coded in, but if you were clever, you could get it to actually ask the LLM to generate the tiny habit for you around certain things. So that's something to think about here, is to convert these hard coded tiny habits into an actual prompt which asks the LLM to suggest a tiny habit around something, like a creative writing prompt, and then come back. So that's where I sort of want people to take it. That's my sort of nudge in terms of experimentation there. Right, summarization 3. Okay, prompting Gemini to summarize. There we go. So we're just summarizing our old friend there, which is the quick reference notes over the lazy dog. This sentence is famous, you probably know this already. Summarize the following one concise sentence. There's the original text, there's Gemini summary, and the tiny habit, concise communication. Once a week, summarize a complex article or document using Gemini, then compare its summary to your own. Yeah, I'm a bit of a tiny habits evangelist at the moment, and I'll definitely be doing a My Life in Objects episode on that. Okay, translation English to French. Yeah, so you can see we've got this in the prompt. There. The instructions and then the English sentence. So you go. Translate one common phrase daily using Gemini, then try to use it in conversation or thought. Well, that's an idea. Start thinking in the language. Oh, good old code snippet generation. The Go factorial function. So it's always interesting to see how large language models sort of express this as code, and normally they'll demarcate. Anyway, I'm trying to think of the word I'm trying to use now. Demarc or whatever it is. I don't know if it's going to do it here or not, but you'll sometimes see where it puts the code inside these sort of three little dashes, top and bottom. And that makes it a little bit easier if you're then trying to save this to MD files. Now notice here, in other programs I do sometimes, not necessarily tiny experiments, I'll have it saved to an MD file. That's not happening here, okay, just so you know, there's no save to MD file. So once I close out the session, I've lost all of this. So if I wanted to keep any of this, I'd have to copy paste it or write a function to save the results to MD, to a markdown file. Tiny habit, code review buddy. Before writing a new utility function, ask Gemini for a basic implementation and compare it to your approach. Okay, question answering, that's pretty straightforward. Capital of Canada. When a random question pops into your head, use Gemini to find the answer immediately. A curiosity cultivator. Okay. Number 7. Not really keeping up down this side, but I think you've got the gist. This is all pretty repetitive. And again, you could probably refactor this to make it a little bit cleaner. Okay, brainstorming ideas, productivity app idea. Here we go. Suggest 5 innovative ideas for a mobile app that helps with productivity. So again, leaning into Google Gemini via Go and the function we have here to talk to the Gemini API. Okay, you can see it's pretty involved there. Got quite a nice set of answers. 5 innovative ideas. What's our tiny habit for this experiment? Idea generator. Once a week, dedicate 10 minutes to brainstorming new project ideas using Gemini as a co-pilot. Okay, sentiment analysis. Okay, and some of the, well, I think most of these you've probably seen when I did 10 tiny experiments to just do in an LLM, which was an earlier episode. Yep, so we've got here and why. Analyze the sentiment. The following sentence, positive, negative, or neutral. There we go. Analyze the sentiment of a few customer feedback snippets daily to better understand user emotions and also to test how good it is at analysing sentiment. Chicken and broccoli. Okay. Recipes. I don't know if I covered recipes on a particular... That's another thing I never think of using an API to do, actually. But yeah, I'm not an API and LLM, but yeah. That's a thing to play around with. Chicken and broccoli. Okay. Here we go. Oh. And then the final one is a role-playing capability. Okay. And you can see all these prompts are pretty simple. We're not doing, I mean, there's some really clever prompt shenanigans you can get up to. You can do things in the API like mess with the temperature. You can do things like play around with switching thinking, setting a thinking budget. Other things like, what do they call it? Search grounding in Google Gemini. So in the, just jumping up to the calling API, the request body here, if you dig out the document for the API, which I'll include the links to, there's a section on using search grounding for this particular model, set of models, and it's to do with parts of this request body. And in here you have to insert. Now, one thing about Go is I've noticed is for some of the other languages there are specific libraries available for Google Gemini for certain things, and indeed you can find there are Go modules available for a lot of the function calling. But I think for some of the more advanced stuff, like being able to handle the stuff to do particularly with the search grounding, you have to go old school and actually construct your own request body. Now if you look at the curl example in the API documentation, you can actually work out how to do that, but you've basically got to convert the curl, the way the curl is laid out, the contents is laid out in a curl prompt or curl request versus how it would be laid out using the specific syntax that Go uses for building, JSON requests. And you can sort of work it out by looking at what's here already in terms of the parts and various other things, and seeing where, by comparing it to the curl example, where stuff might slot in this sort of structure. Because we've sort of got a set of key value pairs, I suppose, but just organised specific to the way it's laid out for Go in this particular example. Anyway, let's get back to the actual experiment 10. Our grumpy wizard. So there's experiment 10. Act as a grumpy old wizard. Tell me why I shouldn't trust L's, be concise and a bit cynical. So what we're doing here is we're putting this in the prompt. Now, in some APIs, and I'm not sure what the status is currently with Gemini, because I've had problems in the past, but you can issue system, like a persona type thing, to the model as a system prompt separately. Here it's all bundled up. Now my understanding is on certain systems actually all it does is a lot of times it takes a system prompt and just sandwiches it together with the full prompt. But here you can say I'm putting something that some people might use as a system prompt on other LLM API interfaces, like in a Llama you might be doing it that way depending on what sort of interface you're using. But here it's just in front of the rest of this. So that's the an easier way to do it. Yeah. So if you want to turn it into a grumpy pirate, then you can say act as a grumpy old pirate as well. And we could change that if we wanted to, but I'll leave that up to you to experiment. Tiny habit, perspective shift. Once a month, try to solve a problem by asking Gemini to role play a different persona. Yeah. So you can do sensible, you can do sensible personas as well. I've done all sorts of things over the, since there's been an explosion in the use of LLMs, particularly to do with certain paradigms, or I'm trying to think of the correct term here, but you know, like stuff that's based on personality types is an interesting thing to play around with as well. You can do that and you get some pretty interesting results. Or you can use things like, you know, act as a stoic, or act as an introvert, or you know, whatever. And you can sort of play around with how much that shapes the answer. So we're working on 2 levels here. Obviously, it's a good way to see how Go, at a real fundamental level, handles requests to the Google Gemini API. But of course, you can play around with the prompts here and try out some of these and mess about with the tiny habits. What was the tiny habit for the meal prep? Before grocery shopping, ask Gemini for a recipe based on ingredients you have. Yeah, that's a really interesting thing to do. Like, what have I got in my fridge? And you can actually say, you know, this is what I currently have access to. Got any good recipes for that? So, yeah, I'm all for doing that. So there we have it. Hopefully you enjoyed this. As I said, I'll include all the links in the description that you would hopefully need to do this, and including the one where you can go to set up a Google Gemini key, which you will need to do this. Thanks once again for watching. Bye for now, and I will catch you in a future episode.